The rupture between Reform UK and the BBC marks a new flashpoint in the corporation's credibility crisis. What began as a transatlantic controversy over an edited Donald Trump speech has now cascaded into domestic political fallout, costing the BBC both trust and access. The story begins with the Panorama documentary Trump: A Second Chance, broadcast ahead of the 2024 US election. The programme included an edit that spliced together two parts of Trump's January the 6th 2021 speech, one line about walking down to the Capitol and another nearly an hour later declaring "We fight like hell." In context, the first referred to a political rally, the second to alleged electoral corruption. The edit created the false impression that Trump had directly incited the Capitol attack. A leaked internal BBC memo from Michael Prescott, an editorial advisor, condemned the cut as a distortion of the day's events. His memo asked with striking prescience, why should the BBC be trusted and where will all this end? That question now echoes through the corridors of Broadcasting House. The ensuing scandal forced the resignations of Director General Tim Davie and the head of news Deborah Turness, and drew an extraordinary threat from Trump to sue the BBC for $1 billion. He says he is obliged to do this, but we'll find out more about that later. In this fraught atmosphere, Reform UK announced it would no longer cooperate with a BBC documentary entitled The Rise of Reform, lots of alliteration there, produced by October Films and fronted by Laura Kuenssberg. The irony is that October Films themselves were not responsible for the Panorama edit. Well, nobody's really responsible because the BBC outsources almost all its creativity. They were commissioned separately to chart the party's growth, granted what the BBC called unprecedented access to Nigel Farage and senior Reform figures, but the association with the wider scandal proved fatal. An internal Reform email later leaked called the Panorama edit disinformation and instructed members to politely decline further participation. It acknowledged October Films had conducted themselves professionally, yet declared that trust had been lost. Councillors who had already been filmed were urged to withdraw consent from their footage to be used. Kent County Council leader Lyndon Kemkaran did precisely that, publicly rescinding all permission for the material gathered over several weeks. Other Reform officials followed suit. The production company, reportedly in panic mode, has been pleading with the party to reconsider, but sources suggest the damage is irreparable. Lee Anderson, Reform's chief whip, summarised the party's position on GB News. We've seen what they did to Donald Trump. You can't trust an organisation that edits facts to fit a narrative. His statement, though populist in tone, reflects a broader public sentiment, one that the BBC cannot afford to dismiss. Of course, the reality is that once you shed a little sunlight onto Reform UK, the edifice crumbles, and that almost certainly is what they're worried about. The Rise of Reform documentary, once billed as a major political profile, now faces an uncertain future. Without the cooperation of its subject, it risks collapsing altogether, much like I expect the party will collapse before the next election. October Films invested months of filming, yet their project is now tainted by association with a different team's journalistic failure. This episode is more than a quarrel between a broadcaster and a populist party. It illustrates the fragility of institutional trust in British media. The BBC's editorial misjudgment has reverberated far beyond the Trump story. It has undermined confidence among domestic political actors, from the right-wing Reform UK to mainstream conservatives who already viewed the corporation with suspicion. The broader issue is one of accountability. Public trust in news rests not on perfection, but on transparency and swift correction. Here the BBC was slow, defensive, and internally divided. The Prescott memo was buried until leaked to the press. Only after public exposure did BBC Chair Samir Shah issue an apology, calling the edit an error of judgment. For Nigel Farage, the timing is opportune. He can reframe Reform's withdrawal as a stand for integrity against an establishment broadcaster tainted by bias. The BBC, meanwhile, faces an existential dilemma: how to repair its reputation as the impartial chronicler of political life while fending off attacks from both right and left. To Reform's credit, I suppose this now means we won't be gifted an endless supply of Nigel Farage on Question Time or on Laura Kuenssberg's show on a Sunday morning. That must be some relief, the relief of reform. In the end, the fallout may reshape relations between British politics and public broadcasting. The BBC's next leadership will inherit a fractured institution mistrusted by the very subjects it seeks to cover. And Reform UK, ever eager to challenge establishment narratives, will seize this as proof of its own authenticity. What began as a misjudgment is a foolish edit of a speech in Washington has become a parable of modern media's fragility. One splice of tape, one lapse of editorial ethics, and the trust of nations unravels.